May 27, 1942, Gazala, Libya. The desert is already burning beneath the morning sun. Across the flat, empty landscape, dust clouds rise into the sky as hundreds of German and Italian vehicles race toward the British defensive positions. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery, fuel carriers. A massive column stretching across the desert. Rommel's Panzer Army Afrika is moving, and its objective is simple. Break through the British armored forces protecting the Gazala line, then open the road toward Tobruk. But waiting for them are hundreds of British tanks. Many are small American-built M3 Stuart light tanks. They are fast. They are reliable. But their 37mm guns are badly outmatched by some of the German tanks now moving toward them. And the British crews don't yet know that something much more dangerous is about to appear on the battlefield. Because hidden behind the German advance are weapons designed to destroy aircraft that are about to become some of the most feared anti-tank guns in the desert, the German 88. And by the end of the day, the desert will be covered with burning tanks, British and German alike. The Gazala line was not a conventional defensive position. Instead of building one enormous fortress, the British had created a series of fortified positions known as boxes. Each position contained troops, artillery, anti-tank weapons, supplies, and mines. Between them stretched vast areas of open desert. The system was designed to make any German advance costly. But there was a problem. The desert gave both sides enormous freedom of movement. There were no forests to hide in, no mountains to block the horizon, no cities to protect the tanks, only sand, rock, and distance. British armored units waited behind their positions. Among them were crews of the 4th Armored Brigade. Inside one Stuart tank, Lieutenant Bill Close watched the horizon. The little tank was compact and fast. Its crew knew how to maneuver it. But against German medium tanks, the Stuart's 37mm cannon had serious limitations. At long range, its shells might strike German armor, but fail to penetrate. Close knew that. His crew knew that. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Germans knew it too. Then the dust appeared. At first, it looked like a storm, but it wasn't. The clouds were moving too quickly. Vehicles began emerging from the haze. One tank, then another, then dozens. German armor. The British crews loaded their guns. The radios came alive, and suddenly the desert erupted. German Panzer III tanks moved forward in formation. Their crews had been trained to fight as coordinated units. Some tanks stopped and fired. Others advanced. Then the roles reversed. The formation moved forward like a giant machine. The British Stuarts fired back. 37mm shells crossed the desert. Some struck German tanks. Most failed to do serious damage. The German 50mm guns were more dangerous. Their shells slammed into the lighter British vehicles. One Stuart erupted in flames, then another. Inside the British tanks, crews fought desperately to keep their vehicles moving. Every second mattered. A stationary tank was a target. A burning tank was a death sentence. Close ordered his driver forward. The Stuart bounced across the rough desert ground. The gunner searched through the sight. A German Panzer appeared in the distance. Target! The loader pushed an armor-piercing round into the breach. The gun fired. The shell struck the German tank. But instead of penetrating, it ricocheted away. The Panzer continued advancing. Close stared through the sight. Then another German tank appeared. And another. The odds were getting worse. The German commanders expected resistance. What they did not expect was the appearance of larger British tanks. Through the dust came the M3 Grant. Unlike the tiny Stuart, the Grant was a substantial vehicle. It carried a 75mm gun mounted in the hull. It also had a 37mm gun in the turret. And suddenly the German advance encountered something it could not simply ignore. A Grant fired. The 75mm shell crossed the battlefield. It struck a Panzer III. The German tank exploded. For a moment, everything changed. German crews who had been advancing confidently suddenly had a new problem. The Grants could hit them from much farther away. Their armor was substantial, and their 75mm guns could deliver a devastating punch. Another Grant fired. A German tank burned. Then another. The German advance began slowing. Inside one Panzer III, the crew watched the larger enemy vehicles through the gun sight. The commander realized what was happening. The British had brought heavy firepower into the fight, and the German tanks needed help. Erwin Rommel was not sitting safely hundreds of kilometers behind the battle. He preferred to remain close to the action. His command vehicle moved across the desert, while radios carried reports from the front. German tank crews were encountering unexpectedly strong resistance. British Grants were holding positions. German artillery support was still moving forward. The battlefield was becoming chaotic. Rommel needed something powerful enough to stop the Grants. His answer was waiting behind the tanks. the 88mm flak gun. Originally developed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the 88 had already demonstrated its ability to destroy armored vehicles. But there was a problem. The guns had to be brought forward. Crews needed time to deploy them. And the British tanks were already firing. Rommel ordered the 88s forward. Half-tracks raced across the desert. Behind them came the enormous guns. The crews jumped down. They began preparing the weapons. Then, boom! A British shell landed nearby. Sand erupted into the air. Another explosion followed. The British Grants had spotted the gun crews. The German soldiers continued working. They had to. If the 88s were not ready soon, the Panzer units could be destroyed. The first gun was ready. The barrel swung toward a British Grant. The range was calculated. The gun commander gave the order. The loader pushed a massive armor-piercing round into the breech. The gun fired. The explosion was enormous. The 88's shell crossed the desert at tremendous velocity. It struck the Grant. The British tank erupted. The German crews immediately loaded another round. Another Grant appeared. The gun traversed. Fire! At the front of the German attack, German tank commanders watched the British line. The Grants were concentrating their attention on the 88s. That created an opening. The German tanks began moving around the British flank. Dust swallowed their lower hulls. Engines roared. Tracks hammered the desert. The Germans were no longer attacking directly. They were maneuvering. The Stuart tanks tried to turn. The Grants began rotating their hulls, but turning toward one threat exposed them to another. The British armor was becoming trapped between German fire from the front and German tanks moving around the side. A Panzer III fired at a Grant. The shell struck its side armor. The tank burst into flames. Another German tank fired. Another Grant burned. But the British did not collapse immediately. They fought back. One Stuart raced forward. Its 37mm gun fired at a Panzer III. This time at close range, the shell penetrated. The German tank stopped. Smoke poured from its hatches. The crew scrambled out. For a few seconds, the little Stuart had achieved what it could not do at long range. But there were still dozens of German tanks around it. Lieutenant Bill Close knew his position was becoming impossible. British tanks were burning everywhere. German vehicles were moving around the flanks. Artillery support was not immediately available, but Close continued fighting. His Stuart moved into position. A German Panzer appeared. Close ordered the gunner to engage. The gun fired. The shell struck. The German crew abandoned their tank, but then another explosion erupted nearby. A British tank had been hit. The crew jumped from the burning vehicle. Machine gun fire began striking the sand around them. Close saw the survivors. He couldn't simply leave them. He maneuvered his Stuart toward them. The tank crawled across the battlefield. Close exposed himself through the hatch to direct the rescue. Then, somewhere in the German line, a Panzer commander saw him. The Stuart was close. Its commander was exposed, and that made it a valuable target. The German gunner traversed the cannon. The commander gave the order. The Panzer fired. The shell struck Close's Stuart. The tank shook violently. Smoke poured from the hull. The driver was wounded. The vehicle was immobilized. Close shouted for his crew to abandon the tank. They climbed out. The desert around them was filled with gunfire. Close dropped behind the burning vehicle. His tank was finished. But he wasn't. The German attack continued. The Grants were now under pressure from several directions. The 88s kept firing. The Panzer III formations pressed forward. British tanks attempted to retreat. Some were destroyed while withdrawing. Others disappeared into clouds of dust. The battlefield became a maze of burning wrecks. But then something unexpected happened. From far behind the British lines came the sound of artillery. Deep explosions rolled across the desert. The British field artillery had finally organized its response. 25-pounder shells began falling among the German formations. The Germans were suddenly taking fire from a new direction. A Panzer III was struck. The crew abandoned the burning vehicle. Another shell landed nearby. Dust and fragments filled the air. German commanders realized that continuing forward could become extremely dangerous. The tank advance slowed. The British armor was already retreating. But now German tanks also had to deal with British artillery. The battle was no longer a simple armored engagement. It had become a contest between tanks, artillery, communications, and maneuver. British tanks began pulling back. One vehicle after another disappeared into the dust. Close managed to find another Stuart. He climbed aboard with surviving crew members. There was no time to recover the damaged tank. There was no time to rest. The German advance was still coming. Close ordered the driver forward. The Stuart moved back across the desert. German shells landed around them. A British tank nearby exploded. Another disappeared behind a cloud of smoke. The British armored force was withdrawing. The Germans had broken through. But they had paid for it. Burning German tanks were scattered across the battlefield alongside British wrecks. The victory had not been cheap, and Rommel knew it. Still, the strategic objective was now within reach. The road toward Tobruk was opening. The British armored forces had been pushed back, and the German advance could continue. Rommel's half-track finally moved toward the battlefield. The commander wanted to see the results himself. Around him were wrecked tanks, burning vehicles, dead machinery, spent ammunition, dust hanging over everything. The 88mm guns stood behind the advancing German armor. Their crews were exhausted, but their weapons had changed the battle. The Grants had been a serious threat. The Stuarts had fought stubbornly. British artillery had eventually forced the Germans to slow down. But the German combination of maneuver, armor, and the 88s had broken the British armored formation. Rommel's plan had worked. The path toward Tobruk was open. But the battle had revealed something important. The Desert War would not be decided by one tank alone. Not the Stuart, not the Grant, not the Panzer III, not even the 88. Victory came from how weapons were combined, how quickly commanders reacted, how well crews communicated, how effectively units maneuvered, and how much risk a commander was willing to accept. The Gazala fighting demonstrated the brutal reality of armored warfare in North Africa. The Stuart was fast and dependable, but its 37mm gun struggled against German medium tanks at longer ranges. The Grant brought much greater firepower. Its 75mm gun could threaten German armor, but its design had limitations. The Panzer III was maneuverable and well-suited to the desert, but against the heavier Grant, it needed tactical advantages. And then there was the 88. It was not originally created as a dedicated anti-tank gun, yet when German crews placed it in the anti-armor role, it became devastating. The weapon gave Rommel something his tanks desperately needed: long-range firepower. It could force British tanks to stop. It could destroy them before they reached effective range. And it could create opportunities for German armor to maneuver. But the 88 did not win the battle by itself. The Germans still had to move. They still had to communicate. They still had to survive British artillery. And the British still managed to inflict serious losses. That is what makes Gazala so fascinating. It wasn't a simple story of superior German tanks defeating inferior British tanks. It was a battle of decisions, a battle of range, a battle of terrain, and above all, a battle of timing. After the fighting, the desert was littered with wreckage: burned-out Stuarts, damaged Grants, destroyed Panzers, abandoned vehicles, spent shell casings, tracks leading away into the distance. The battle had opened the way for Rommel's forces to continue their advance. Tobruk was now vulnerable. The fortress had resisted German attacks before, but the British defensive situation was deteriorating. The Gazala battles would continue. The fighting would become even more intense. Eventually, Tobruk would fall to Rommel's forces in June 1942. Rommel would be promoted to field marshal. His reputation as the Desert Fox would become even greater. But the men who fought at Gazala knew the truth. Behind every famous commander were crews sitting inside, machines that could become burning wrecks in seconds. For the tank commanders, there was no legend. There was only the next target, the next shell, the next order, and the hope that the enemy's gunner would make a mistake before they did. Lieutenant Bill Close survived the war. His actions at Gazala earned him the Military Cross. Johannes Rommel continued fighting in North Africa and Italy and received Germany's highest military decorations before being killed in a vehicle accident near Anzio in 1944. And Rommel would continue his campaign across North Africa. But on that May morning in 1942, none of them knew how the story would end. They only knew what was directly in front of them: a desert, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and an enemy determined to break through. The German panzers had advanced. The British Stuarts had resisted. The Grants had struck back. The 88s had opened fire. And finally, the British line had broken. But the most important lesson from Gazala wasn't that one tank was better than another. It was that battlefield power comes from the combination of weapons, men, movement, and decisions. A tank can have thicker armor. Another can have a bigger gun. A third can be faster. But none of those advantages matter if the commander cannot use them at the right moment. At Gazala, Rommel found that moment. The 88s stopped the Grants. The Panzers moved around the flank. The British armor was forced to turn. The German attack continued, and the road to Tobruk opened. Across the North African desert, burning tanks marked the path of the battle. For the soldiers who survived, the memory would never be about the maps. It would be the sound, the engines, the cannon fire, the explosions, the radio voices, and the sudden silence after a tank disappeared into a cloud of smoke. Because in the desert, there was nowhere to hide. And when two armored armies finally collided, The only question was, who would still be moving when the dust settled?